Welcome all to today's session of the Talent Leadership Series, Getting Past Taboo, Race in the Workplace. My name is Shani Galvin, and I work on the 4A's Learning and Development team here. I'm so pleased to welcome our thought leaders today, Keesha Jean-Baptiste of Wyden Kennedy's Portland headquarters, and Glenn Singleton, author of Courageous Conversations About Race. In the next hour, they will provide guidance on the tools to building a true culture of inclusion. But before we start, we'd like to review some logistics to maximize your experiences. First, you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you have any problems viewing the presentation on your computer, it could be a security issue on your end, and you may need to contact your IT person. If you need to contact us via email, please reach out to webinar@aaaa.org. We'll help you if you have any technical issues on our end. And if you disconnect for any reason, just go back to the email invitation and log in again. For some background information on our leaders, Keesha Jean-Baptiste is the Director of Human Resources for Wyden Kennedy's flagship office in Portland, Oregon, where she has a history of hiring, developing, and sustaining top-performing talent and leadership teams. But the work she's most proud of is reflected in the culture of Wyden Kennedy, and that begins by creating an environment where people can bring their full selves to the now 600-person office. Glenn Singleton has devoted over 30 years to constructing a racial equity worldwide and developing leaders to do the same. He's the creator of Courageous Conversations About Race, a protocol for sustained, deep dialogue and beyond diversity, a curriculum that has taught hundreds of thousands of people how to use it. As president and founder of Pacific Educational Grouping, Glenn has created an agency that has developed racially conscious leaders in a variety of sectors, including education, government, business, law enforcement, and community organizing, among them. So before we dive in, there's two things that we wanted to point out. One is that at the end of the webinar, we'll have a few minutes for questions. However, please feel free to send us your questions as we go along the webinar. You can do this by submitting them through our question module on the side-hand panel. We want this interactive session to be as engaging as possible, so we'll be launching a few polls to keep an eye. So keep an eye out for that, and this will be coming your way later. And lastly, we encourage everyone to tweet during this webinar, as you can see our hashtag and as well as our learning and development handle at the bottom of the screens. Our hashtag, just as a reminder, is hashtag 4A's webinars, and our handle is @4A's learning. So now, please welcome Keesha to kick things off.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. As Shannon said, my name is Keesha Jean-Baptiste, and I'm the Director of HR for Wyden Kennedy's Portland office, which happens to be our headquarters. While that's really good information for you guys to know, I also want to share with you a couple of personal bits about myself. First, as you can probably hear from my voice, I'm a woman. Second is I'm a Black woman, and I'm heterosexual. I'm married to a Black man, and I have 2 Black children. I spent most of my career working in agencies in New York, and the last 7 years I've been living in Portland, Oregon. We're going to talk about race today, as you know, and I know that this is a topic that for many of us is awfully complicated. It's complicated in our social lives, it's complicated in our lives outside of work, which makes it even more complicated when you introduce the topic of race at work. It's also incredibly misunderstood. And typically in a workplace environment, race is one of those things that you're not supposed to go near. And so part of today's talk is to share with you a little bit about Wyden Kennedy's journey, where we are, where we've been, where we are now, and some of the things that we've learned along the way. I'm going to be honest and truthful with you about things we've gotten right and the things that we're still working on perfecting. And as part of sharing with you today, I want to take you through a couple of pieces in our history that I refer to as just some major pivot points and arcs. And the first one actually is going to start with a piece from 2009, and it's with Dan Wyden. I'd like you to take a listen to it right here.
I ended up asking myself a very serious question. I said, Wyden, what do you really, really care about? What's really driving you nuts? And if you could change one thing before you check out of this world, what would it be? And that was actually a pretty simple answer. And this issue continues to gnaw on me because, like it or not, in this business, I essentially hire a bunch of white, middle-class kids, pay them enormous sums of money to do what? To create messages to the inner city, to kids who create the culture the white kids are trying the hell to emulate. But if you go into the inner city, odds are these kids aren't even going to see advertising as a possibility, as an opportunity for them. And now that's fucked up. I mean, it is, I'm sorry, but don't get me wrong. Now, I'm not bringing this up today because I think Wieden+Kennedy is doing this phenomenal goddamn job of rectifying the situation. I think we've made some progress, but we've got miles and miles to go before we sleep.
So as I said, I'm gonna start by telling you a couple of things that are true, and a couple of things that if I were to look back and just say, okay, where could we have gotten better? Where could we fine tune? What does that really mean as far as the work that Wieden+Kennedy and all of us in this industry are trying to do? So the first truth is that Dan Wyden is great. He's a visionary leader. He makes bold statements. This isn't the first time he made pretty bold statements about race and his feelings and his agitation related to the racial disparity in the industry. It wasn't the first time. But this particular time, he was really fed up. And he was fed up because of the lack of action. He was also fed up because of the visible disparity that you could see in every setting that he at this time was going in and out of. And as he said, in full confession, the flaw is that Wieden+Kennedy wasn't quite there yet either. So while he could stand in front of everyone in this audience and make and proclaim this observation, he was also honest in saying, we're not doing any better than the rest of you, but we're better together. So the approach that Dan took as someone who is a white male and at the time, really further along in his career, the approach that he took, that he just knew, the only thing he knew how to do at that particular time was just to say, you're going to do it. This is a mandate. I want this agency to be diversified. And I don't see any reason why we can't get there. And so his approach was to tell people just like that. And his approach also was, if you have a problem with it, come see me and let's talk about this. So this man who was full of passion, who was also full of frustration, put his hand down as a leader in the company just to say, this is what I want. And I will tell you, because many people turn to Wieden+Kennedy and say, oh my God, you guys have it figured out. You have Dan Wyden. Well, having an impassioned leader who's as vocal as Dan is great, but it's not enough. It doesn't mean you have strategy. It doesn't mean you have buy-in. And it certainly doesn't mean you have a movement. And so the approach that the agency took a while ago was for it to be a mandate. It was an obligation. There was a hiring obligation. And I'll tell you, the top-down approach alone doesn't work. Dominant culture in advertising prevails. Dominant culture at Wieden+Kennedy prevails. And in fact, what we found was that many people were just unsure as to what diversity means. So while he powered up his message, HR empowered his message, but diversity is much more complicated than that, as I hope many of you who are listening in know, and you will certainly learn when you hear from Glenn in a little bit. The other thing is that the topic, the word diversity is so broad and certainly has broadened over the years that many people don't know what to attribute it to anymore. And in this particular case, in most cases when you hear from Dan Wyden, he was talking very specifically about racial diversity. And I venture to guess that many of us in our agencies have heard the word diversity and inclusion used, and I wonder for how many of you actually know what your agency means by that. If it doesn't mean racial diversity or gender, if you don't have a very specific concrete view, then I would suggest that it's a discussion that still needs to be had. So we started to talk about what it means. We started to talk about and uncover what the world through a racial perspective would look like, and how we could actually transform our agency if we were to get to a set of normalized discussions on the complexity of race, the barriers related to race, the opportunities related to race, and to really dig in. We also found, which is just an insight, you know, in multiple places I've worked, and also what was true at Wieden and Kennedy at the time, is that we had many people going along with the program that were tolerating it. And tolerance is very different than acceptance. And when you get to a place where you are able to fully have conversations, where people are engaged, where you're also in a space where accepting is where you're learning and leaning in, there's a big difference and there's a sea change there. And that's what we started to see at Wieden and Kennedy. And a lot of it has to do with a change in our approach. So if you look at these two circles on this slide here, there's often the world of diversity exists on both sides. The left side is really what's going on the inside of any company, any agency, right? Which is, we talk about diversity as part of culture. We talk about diversity in terms of diverse hiring. We talk about diversity to an extent when it comes to looking at stats and who we're developing. We also generally talk about diversity when it comes to the supplier chain. There are trade organizations, there's mandates, there are quotas to some extent, even from the supplier side, that really focus us there. From a business perspective with our clients talk about diversity in terms of their brands, who the target audiences are, how they're going to connect with those through their marketing and advertising and through imagery. They also focus on it from a social perspective and through PR. And then the common link comes back to the supplier chain, because that's where the mandate lives. Well, what I found really interesting is that in most of this, and if you watch and you listen to companies, if you put mission statements side by side, there isn't a lot of focus on the human element. And the human element is what all of these two circles are bound by, which is people. People who have lived experiences as people of color, who identify with different world cultures, people who are employees at our agencies, who live and walk in that life. And so the change had to come from us really being able to focus on the inside and to say, what does this mean? We haven't yet humanized our efforts. We're talking outside of ourselves. We're talking to the world in many cases with the work we put out, but we haven't humanized what we needed to do on the inside. And so we needed to get real about that, and we needed to focus in a different way on how we were going to address that. So I'll tell you, and this dates to, I think, 2.5, 3 years ago, when I was introduced to Glenn Singleton and started to look at different ways of approaching the problem. I'd worked in a place where, in many organizations, where approaching the issue of diversity was really a non-human experience. It was words, we're talking at each other in a most rational way, in a very linear way, but not yet tapping into the human experience, not tapping into the people side. And so what we needed to do as a way of changing course and as a way of changing mindsets and tapping into belief systems, also as a way of taking the words away from just Dan Wieden and into our employee base, was we needed to understand how to be empathetic. And the ability to be empathetic really is your ability to understand and share the feelings of each other. And when that happens, we all get to a place of deeper understanding and meaning. We also get to a place where we can say, as a culture, what are you holding back? I want to know, I want to hear, because we care, but also because this is an environment where we're saying to you that if you can't be your true self here, then we know we're not getting the best of you and the work that you're here to do. And so if we're really about diversity, if we're really about changing culture, then we have to be all about this question, which says, what are you holding back? And a lot of the work with diversity, what we found is even if you have leadership buy-in, and even if you have a plan and an approach, there is a segment of everyone's population made up of the people of color who generally hold out who they are by the time they walk into work. So what would happen in a culture if you said, you have permission to be all of who you are. You have permission to feel like you have a place of belonging. You have permission to not withhold the things that you might be holding back. What happens with that culture? And for us, what it meant was we needed to be real. We needed to get to the heart of the matter. We needed to tap in a very different way with a third eye and with all of our ears to listen. And so 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, we came up with a plan with Glenn, which was to start a workshop called Courageous Conversations About Race. And I'll tell you, the word courage needs to be in all caps, or courageous needs to be in all caps. Glenn, to this day, starting 3 years ago, he's still our partner and my partner specifically on this work at Wieden & Kennedy. And what's happened is our employees have been able to learn and understand the complexities of race. And race as a matter of a social construct, and what that leads to in terms of institutional racism, what it leads to in terms of how we work and interact together, how we socialize. But we've been able to develop a vernacular, a common place of being able to meet, and a common place of being able to speak that's allowed us to get really real about what's going on. So what I want to share with you is a video coming from some of the employees that work at Wieden & Kennedy as they're thinking and reflecting about their racial experiences, and also a reflection of the workshops that we've run with Glenn.
This monster of an ideology that was created.
Because at times I can't be myself culturally of like who I am, and the way my name is said. My name is not Romero, my name is Ramito.
To separate, we had 150 people in my graduating class, and I was the only brown student, and conquer.
I just want to be viewed as someone who's good at their job and excels because of the work they do, and not necessarily because of the color of my skin.
And deny.
My partner's white, and I'm Latino, and we walk into stores, and people follow me around. This very thing happened like 3 weeks before, and I made it obvious to him. I was like, "This woman's following me around. You noticed that, right?" And he was like, "She was. That's weird." Well, maybe it was just because this or this. And like, it's because I'm Latino.
And infiltrate really the minds and bodies and souls of people.
We did intern presentations this week, and one of the interns wore a suit and tie, or he wore a tie, and someone made a flippant comment which was, "Oh, are you going to court?" Now that's a minority person wearing a suit, dressed up because they're going to do a presentation, and the response is, "You're going to court." Not, "Did you have a job interview?" Not, "Did you just come from a funeral?" But, "Oh, you're going to court." So that's where the bar is. That's the reality.
There's a lot of things that we've overcome over the ages, and this can be one of them.
Race is a thing that I think most of us would just have feelings about it, but don't really feel compelled to start talking about it.
People are so afraid to offend one another and so afraid to talk about race. It's just that big elephant in the room.
It's called Courageous Conversations because it takes courage to allow yourself to be vulnerable to what you're really feeling, and then to say it to other people.
I think I just saw it and I was like, HR training. Been through many conversations about diversity. They never lead anywhere. It was, oh fuck, I haven't got time. I've got 17 fires going on.
I think the first day left us with a lot of raw emotion.
A lot of the people that I work with were oblivious to how I'm living versus them.
We talked about fail harder and how for a lot of people in the agency fail harder doesn't necessarily resonate. I don't feel like I can fail harder. I feel like my window of failure is much smaller.
It's not a level playing field, and not really his problem to solve. That's our problem to solve, because we want people to come here to feel safe and to do the best work of their lives, and for us to allow that and promote that. And he's been put in the worst position. That's ours to solve. I would have not known that all these days.
There are definitely times in Portland where you walk, or where you feel like you're the only person of color. Or not feel like. There have been times when you're at a restaurant and you look around and there's no one else who looks like you.
You have this realization that I am completely fucking oblivious to the experience of other people that I work so closely with. And I am completely fucking oblivious to my own privilege. I was kind of blown away at the problems that we are going to have as an agency if we don't get out of the Portland and white bubble. Like, if our job is to puncture culture and create it in new places, we gotta stop talking to ourselves.
I know that I am very different at home, very different with my family and with my friends than I am at work. And I've said I want that to stop. I want my children to be able to appreciate, be proud of the culture they come from, not feel like they have to leave it behind.
Every man and woman needs to feel that they have a right to be respected and have a right to live up to their potential.
This larger meaning, this larger context, that it's really about humanity, it's about people.
I dare you to try it. I dare you to go to that deep, dark place in your soul where you know you hide your truest feelings. Go there, acknowledge those things, and then share them. And see what reactions you get, because they might not be the ones you expect.
And so, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Singleton, and I'm happy to join you. I remember my first meeting with Dan Wyden, and sitting in his office, he went to that place that Tia just described in the video. He was quite honest about what he wanted for not only Wyden and Kennedy, but what he wanted for the industry and what he wanted for the larger society. And that sincerity was matched by him introducing me right away to Keesha, who also had a very specific statement of how diversity, inclusion, and equity needed to look in the agency. And so I just believed that the work that I have been doing for the past 3 decades, and in fact this seminar on courageous conversation, was an opportunity to enhance and improve not only the racial consciousness of those in the agency, but also their ability to have basic and sophisticated conversations about ways in which race impacted their lives, their work, and the work that goes out into the larger world. And so what we've done is essentially worked with the agency over a period of 2.5 years in a seminar that enabled participants up to 100 at a time to engage in a real thoughtful conversation about race that began wherever they were and took them as far as the topic goes, using a protocol which everyone learns and then practices, divided into agreements, conditions, and a navigational tool called the compass. We actually helped people in the agency to begin to articulate their own racial reality and develop skills to be able to hear and empathize with others. The 4 agreements really lines the conversation first, and these agreements are agreements which run contrary to the ways that we typically interact, particularly interracially, around conversations about race. And what we're seeing is in other intersections with race, including gender, sexual orientation, religion, and class, we're able to first practice not walking away from the conversation, particularly as the conversation begins to stimulate discomfort for us, as we discover our own racial realities, as well as we get to know the racial perspectives of others that are not necessarily shared by every individual in the room. An ability to just articulate what is true for you, regardless of how right or wrong that is for another, is a critical first step. Until we're able to talk about what's real for us, we're not able to actually look at what's occurring in an organization and how those occurrences may get in the way of us all doing our best work. And finally, we're not attempting to solve the problem of race. We're attempting to improve our relationship with race and our ability to not allow race to get in the way of our work. The conditions are organized in 3 tiers, and these 3 tiers give us direction in the conversation. So practicing the agreements is the primary aspect of the protocol for courageous conversations. But following this pathway through the conversation, regardless of who you're talking to and how well you know that person, allows for a more successful engagement. The first tier begins with one's own personal story. And rather than trying to state the facts, the statistics, as we think we know them in a larger society or even in a larger work context, we're talking about race in our lives first and foremost. We're drawing on our own personal experiences because all of us have them. If we stand in a room for 1 hour, everyone has 1 hour of racial experience. But some of us get more practice in talking about that. Some of us are more invited in our communities to express our views and perspectives around race, and others have been taught exactly the opposite, never to talk about it, and in fact, act like you don't see it, which we call color blindness. And so when we change that paradigm, and everyone comes from that racial reality that we each hold, that is the starting point, and that makes each of us expert right in the beginning. Then we go further to explore and expand that understanding, that experience, that perspective to the contemporary experience, the moment that's occurring right now in our work. The second level is about gaining perspectives that are not our own. And we teach folks to not only have a single perspective of your own, and that's where you begin, but to make space for the other person's perspective who is engaged with you, the missing perspective for all of those who are not present, and the critical race perspective. That is the perspective that will reveal where race and racism are present, not only in our conversation, but in the circumstance in which we are trying to engage. The third level, and the critical level of completing the conversation in every conversation, is to understand that race is more than a color paradigm, one skin color. Race is, in fact, a source and a system of power. And so in order to gain a different way of human beings interacting in a situation, we have to make sure that we're not empowering or disempowering anyone based on something as arbitrary as skin color. And so deepening our understanding of how race as a system of power or whiteness is engaged, is present in a circumstance, in a workplace, in a task that we're doing, in a hiring exercise, is critical to understand how we not only diversify our experience, but also how we create a way that people feel a sense of belonging, that people are also ready to contribute in ways that they never have before. Finally, each of us, as we engage these conversations from our personal through our professional into looking at the organizational, understanding how race as power is influencing and affecting us, we move about parts of our being. And parts of our being include our belief system, which drives our behaviors, which causes us to notice and not notice certain aspects in our experience. We draw on our intellect or our thinking. We draw on our emotions or our feelings. And we also draw on our relationships, our acting. And so the compass allows us to locate ourselves in the conversation. Too often, people enjoy hanging out with other people who are in the same, as we call it, quadrant of the compass. So as a person who reacts to racialized situations, usually from the feeling quadrant, from the emotion, from my personal lifelong experiences around race, which are very clear to me, I also resonate, connect with, find affinity with people who also hang out in the feeling quadrant. And feeling quadrant people struggle to engage sometimes with thinking quadrant people. Thinking quadrant people ask questions about race, like to see data, whereas feeling quadrant people often relive experience of race, joyous or traumatic. Believing people are searching for morality, the right and wrong of a situation, whereas acting people want to engage. They want to be in relationship with the topic, with others around the topic. Acting people protest. Believing people may sit back and watch how people in protest may not have yet clarified what their actual belief systems are about why they're protesting. So in the belief is the why, and in the acting is oftentimes the how. So the seminar that Wieden and Kennedy is engaged in, the seminar that I wrote over 2 decades ago, that is, people practice the seminar all over the world now, has had a real special impact in Wieden and Kennedy. And I think it's partly because of the leadership direction and involvement, but it's also because this is an organization that really is about looking at culture and how to impact culture. So Beyond Diversity is about reculturing the organization, where language and conversation is at the heart of it. There are really 3 goals of this seminar. The first is that participants need to walk away unquestioning around the idea that race matters, and not just in a circumstance where there's a shooting or where someone is pulled over by police officers, or where we're looking at the statistics of very few people of color in advertising or communications or technology, but it's always there. And so how do we move from the circumstantial race matters to the all-encompassing, omnipresent race matters phenomena? The second is that we have to be able to talk about race before we can lead to racial equity, before we can create places where all beings feel included and belonging. And then thirdly, this has to be not an approach that is singular in human resources or hiring, but as Keesha alluded to in the circles before, it's something that transcends one function of the organization and actually permeates all functions of our society. And so dealing with these issues of racial injustice and racial disparity and creating diverse workplaces where people belong, feel a sense of belonging, is about a systemic approach to equity versus random acts or a singular program that has been focused on to bring about diversity, sustain diversity, or promote diversity. And so in the Race Matters piece, we borrow from our most recent Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor, offers 3 reasons for us to consider why race matters. The first being that we have a long history of racial injustice. Race is at the beginning, the foundation, the cornerstone of the American society and societies which have touched from this very powerful country that we live in. And so the first is historic. The second are the persistent indicators that we see in our data, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that. And then finally, it's because the impact of race has far-reaching implications in our economy, in our socialization beyond just our conversations about race. And so her dream, her decision, her view of how we actually challenge the injustices and disparities about race is that we have open conversations that are candid on the subject. And that indeed is what Beyond Diversity and the Courageous Conversation Protocol takes aim at. Here's some data that just shows how race matters, and you can see the disparities and the increasing disparities as the top bar shows you a racially dominant experience or whiteness, or the actual presence of white CEOs in the Fortune 500 in this case, and the bottom line bar shows you that same presence of black CEOs. So that disparity is not only in the Fortune 500, but permeates all sectors in our society. This, looking another way, of black and brown CEOs in the United States, there are only 16 at the time of this sample. And since then, they're now 15. And so these folks are the anomaly in a larger system. And it's not just hiring CEOs who are black and brown or indigenous or Muslim or whatever the case may be, but it's really asking ourselves, why is this the case? And that's where the conversation supports us. In advertising and public relations, 27% of those in the industries are actually people of color. And so this is quite a small number given more than half of our population identifies in this way. When I look at the executive or senior level people, that number goes less than half of the 27%. And you see now only 12% at the executive level. And so there's less conversation because there's less diversity at those higher levels. And I believe one key to what's happening in terms of the progress of Wieden & Kennedy is because at the highest levels, there is this conversation about why the highest levels continue to lack diversity. So those numbers boil out to raw numbers, which in the total population, there are only 9,000, roughly 9,000 people of color in the entire industry, advertising, public relations. And in that industry, those 9,000 people are likely to only see about 1,100 people who reflect their image and perhaps their perspective and experience. So in the second level, it's about the conversation. And here I want to engage you in an exercise so that you can get a feel for what this work is actually like. So here the participants on the webinar can actually engage in the first exercise that we do to begin teaching those courageous conversation conditions. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to answer this question, each person on the webinar, and just write down the number that you believe goes in the box to correspond to this question. How much of your life is impacted by race? And I'd like you to answer it between 0 and 100, with 0 representing you believe that there's no impact of race in your life, to 100 believe that there is a total impact or everything is impacted by race. And I'd just like to give you about 30 seconds now to put a number in the box and we'll move forward. Typically we have a lot of time for this exercise, but here we only have an hour for the whole webinar, so I just want you to feel what that's like. And for some, that answer may have come relatively easy, and for others, you may still be thinking about what number to put in the box, and I'm just going to ask you to put any number now. And what you're also going to get at this point is you're going to get an opportunity to poll, so that Keesha and I can get a sense of where you are. And my belief is that our audience is going to be very similar to where audiences have been over the past 25 years. So now fit your number into one of the following. The first would be your number was anywhere between 0% and 25%. The second, 25% to 49%. The third down, you selected 50%. On to 51 to 99%. Or you selected 100. And let's see what happens here. And I'm just going to do my poll.
We're going to give everybody just a couple more seconds to complete the poll. We'll be closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Wow. Okay, so I could give a lot of explanation, but only 11% of the folks on this webinar have actually arrived at what we all need to arrive at as a first step. Race matters all the time, and therefore we are all impacted by race all the time. So what does that mean for us? First, some people read the question differently, which gave them an answer that's going to be correct for the question they read. Instead of seeing how much of my life is impacted by race, some substituted in a word how much of my life is negatively impacted by race, which then means that you're answering a question, how much of my life is impacted by racism, which is very different than race. So if some people are having a conversation about racism, and that's negative, and some people are talking about racial impact, that could be positive or negative, that could be privilege or oppression, then we're going to get a different response. And so back to the question, there is no positive or negative connection. Therefore, your number should not connect to a positive or negative description of race. Secondly, some see race and they don't see inclusive, but see people of color. So the question might be read, how much of my life is impacted by people of color? Or because Keesha and myself are both black and we are explaining the exercise to people, they may also see how much of my life is impacted by black people, which is a different question, which would yield a different percentage. So when two people arrive at the workplace and are seeing race very differently, negative, positively, or race means black or race means people of color versus race means all of us, we're going to get a different description of the work that we're engaging in, a different way of being about it. And then finally, some people see that as a portion of their experience, the impact, and therefore are thinking about what may be more prominent in the impact. Like, I feel more impacted by where I live or how I grew up or my gender or my sexual orientation or my religion. And so they've almost created a pie graph where in fact all of those descriptions are always impacting us. And so race is 100% impact, as well as gender's 100% impact, sexual orientation's 100% impact. They're all there all the time. The question is not, is race impacting my life, but it's how is race impacting my life? Featured a different way, race matters is now on the slide as your denominator. The racial impact means, to what degree does race matter? Well, race matters all the time, and so that's what the 100 represents. I am impacted by race 100% of the time because race always matters. And with this construction, then I can get conscious about how race is impacting my life and perhaps what to do about that impact. If I don't recognize it to be there, then I'm more likely to say this has nothing to do with race. And if it has nothing to do with race, then there's nothing for me to get conscious about. Whereas this construct says there's always something to get conscious about, and that's what Wieden and Kennedy is setting out to do, to function at the highest level of consciousness versus to function at the lower level of consciousness. And so the systemic piece, which is the last of those three reasons for this particular take on the work and how we engage, is to recognize that this goes above and beyond one single function in the organization. It's more than a hiring practice. It's about everybody, from the top to the more recent employee, across the agency, engaging in every function of the work. And so Keesha will talk a bit now about how this has actually occurred to move away from random acts of equity into a systemic equity transformation direction at Wieden & Kennedy?
So our big problem in the industry is figuring out a way to break up the dominant culture and to recognize the dominance in your culture. You have to be willing to look past a number of things and to get real, as I said earlier, about where the gaps are and what it's going to take to create movement. So some of this work for us has, and for many of us, has to be intentional. You have to operate with intention in every area of your business, every area of your agency, and it goes past looking at HR, it goes past looking at your management team, it goes past even looking at your recruiters, because collective action is what's required to create movement. So part of our journey has been to focus, not just on the hiring aspect, but our approach had to start to embody 5 areas of impact. And I'll let these all come up on the screen just so you can take a read through them. And I would say each area is equally as important. And each of these areas, if you notice in writing, it's written as sort of this present tense. We are always working toward these things. We are working toward unraveling bias through the work that we're doing with Glenn as well as other partners. Becoming culturally competent and also removing that level of unconsciousness as it relates to race specifically is work that we're doing every day. It's uncomfortable. We get to a place where we're talking about microaggressions. We sometimes, honestly, teams have to have timeouts after certain meetings in order to understand what's really going on. We've heard from a lot of people at the agency, people of color, that their voice is getting lost in conversations around ideas and insights. Even things like music selection or voiceovers, you know, that sort of signal either a stereotype or signal a cultural insight. Sometimes those things are lost because we live and work in a dominant industry. So how do you break that up? Education is the place to start. The second area, which I think most companies are probably doing a little bit of, but we need to get better at this, it's the pipeline of talent. The third is being responsible with the talent. Once you hire them, it doesn't end there. We need to be really responsible, mentoring, advocating, having champions for people of color, and really focusing on growth. Partnerships that go deeper is part of our focus as well, where we're finding partners who share our values and also partners who can push us where we need to be pushed, not allowing the internal voice or perspective or sometimes politics, quite frankly, get in the way. Outside partners help give you a view out. And then finally, the client's priorities. We've seen, I'm sure many of you on the call, if you're connected with your new business partners or your PR teams, and if you've done any reading in the last year on what's happening with RFPs, you know, clients are starting to push and push and push and push in this direction to say, agencies, you need to get it together. If I'm going to partner with you, I want to know that I'm partnering with an agency that's diverse. And I have to say it's a shame that things have gotten to that place, but actually it's also smart on one way because agencies usually pay attention more when the clients say it's something they care about too. So this is sort of how our approach has broadened over the years. The next area, which I'll review quickly, is a translation in our culture as to what we're asking for everyone, including myself. I'm an employee of Wieden & Kennedy too. Just because I run HR does not mean I am immune to anything. And I sort of looked at the work that we've done with Glenn, the cultural kind of nuances that we have, and said, okay, what can I ask of everyone that I'm also willing to do myself? Where can I push myself to be even more uncomfortable? How do I know we're all growing toward in the right ways and toward the right things? So I'll let these 5 pieces come up on the screen. I'll let you read them and take them in, and quickly I'll just review. The first thing that we're asking of everyone is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. That is our status quo. Race conversations are happening at work, and that's it. Your voice is your story, share it. And this is just sort of allowing people to be responsible for their lived experience. No one has to apologize for it. No one has to feel awful about it, but not allowing those voices and those stories to be shared is an oppressive cultural environment, and that's something that we wanted to get out of. Hiring someone different than you on your team. God knows there are so many excuses out there as to why we don't have enough diversity in this industry. And to be frank with you guys, I'm sick of hearing the excuses. There are enough people of color in this country, in the world. There are enough ways to expose talent to the industry. There are enough people to train. So if you aren't hiring different, then who is? It's not just up to the recruiter, it's up to the hiring managers too. The fourth is to create a sense of a culture of belonging on your team. I've often found that in many cases, not all, but you have, usually in agencies, you have people who are experiencing their first racial interaction at work. And so sometimes you have whites who have never interacted with blacks or Asians or Hispanic Latinos, and they are experiencing that other culture through work at work. That's going to make for an uncomfortable environment. So hiring alone can't be it. You have to nourish the environment. You have to teach people how to interact. You have to also show people what's wrong in their interactions. And I believe that HR plays a big role in helping to make these things happen. The final piece that I've asked of everyone at Wieden & Kennedy is to make room for the unheard voice. There are times when we're all in a room together at a brainstorm, and we see and hear from certain people all the time. And again, that's a window into looking at dominance. What does dominance look like when you're in a meeting? Well, usually it looks like a certain type of person who speaks, certain level of people who speak. And so if we were all actively focused on making sure the voice that is not heard or quiet, it has a platform to speak up in the room because it's safe, and because people are given permission and they feel like they have a sense of belonging, you will change the culture. So these are the things that we are doing actively. It's where we are now, to be quite frank with you. It's a work in progress every single day, and we are not perfect at it, but we're striving for this. I also need to say, just to be super responsible with you guys, it's chaotic. And it can be not just uncomfortable, but there are times where people are hurt. And you have to be able to deal with that just as much as we have to be able to deal with the highs that come with advancing this work. So I want to take you to another arc in our history and our journey, and this was the final piece that we'll show you via video before we go to questions. And this particular arc happened last summer, and it happened as a result of some of the tragedies in the U.S. where several black men were shot and killed at the hands of police officers. And this particular piece and this action led to, I think, a much more focused culture at Wieden in the Portland office in terms of people who wanted to take action, people who were moved to do something more than just change the workplace. It actually led to the agency focusing on racial justice as a pro bono client and the establishment of an employee group that we call WK Act. So I'll let you take a look at this piece and then we'll close.
Why your black coworker seems especially bitter today. Why your black coworker seems especially sad today. Why your black coworker seems especially quiet today. We are processing. We are asking ourselves what to do. We are hurt because it feels like watching our own selves get gunned down. We are telling ourselves, do not let this make you live in fear. Do not let this make you hate. But we're scared for our lives, our families' lives, our friends' lives. We're mad that the protests aren't working, why the video recordings aren't working. We're conflicted, in a place between crippling empathy for this man and his family and contempt at a world that seems not to care enough. We're disgusted at police, but telling ourselves you can't hate all police. We're wondering what the point of a moment of silence is. We're wondering if we ourselves will make it back home today. We're wondering what to do, what to do, what to do. Just an FYI, not for sympathy, just acknowledging this because it should be acknowledged. The morning of out in Sterling's, when the news kind of bursted out, wake up in the morning, first thing you do is you pick up your phone. And that morning, it just was a bad idea. It just hurt immediately. Like, I literally felt like in that moment, like I was him, and it was scary and painful. I'm on the bus, and I'm the only black person on the bus, and all the people on the bus are like, it's just another morning for them. And I was jealous and mad at that. I was mad that they weren't mad, and that was scary. That's a strange feeling to have. And then I show up here, one of the new guys that started with me, you know, we're cool. He was sitting there, and he says, you know, the customary good morning, and I'm just like, I'm grumbling, I'm like angry. And I was like, you know what? I need to like explain myself. Although I didn't have any expectations on what the email would do, like I said, I didn't think about sending it, think about what would happen after I sent it, think about the repercussions. I didn't think about any of that. I wasn't thinking. But I did, after the fact, thinking about it in retrospect, I found it super interesting that most of the initial replies were just thank you, because I didn't expect that. If anything, I expected the more later replies, like, yeah, I'm sorry, and like, this is messed up, and you know, I expected that, but someone somewhere was thinking I was feeling that, and I didn't exactly, you know, go out and say it, but you said it, and it's like a thank you. When someone expresses themselves, or people express themselves honestly and fully without restraint, that thing, whatever they express, takes on a life of its own, and it really, really, really has. Whenever someone comes across an article, or they have a feeling or a thought that is remotely connected to this, they dig up that email and they, you know, they attach another email to it, and so it created a platform for us all to talk about this. And if I'm proud of anything, no, you didn't ask me that, but if I'm proud of anything, it's that I followed my gut in that moment, like, because like it's so important that, you know, we're all just pieces of this massive puzzle, and it's not right in the U.S. right now, but this is not all the way right, and it's the most important thing. It's the most important thing. It's life and death. People have died. People are dying, and we're alive, and we can do something about it.
So that was an employee who was speaking up about his difference, and that email turned into coverage that was not expected, definitely not planned, but something the agency wanted to do to show that we care. This issue matters. It matters because we're people. It doesn't matter just because we're a company. And there were several pieces written about it that, I have to say, opened our eyes and our hearts to see the world care back. The thing that we've done at Wieden+Kennedy is translate a bit of what is a typical term right now is diversity and inclusion. And not that there's anything wrong with those two words, but you know, just like language, when language becomes overused, things lose meaning. And so for us, what we refer to as a culture of difference and one of belonging. And it's an active work, we're kind of an active pursuit every day of getting to that place, because every day we have to look at and stare at the dominance of our workplace as well. And we have to be willing to get real about it. We have to be willing to call out the things that are standing in the way. And we have to be willing to still hold hands and come back to the table, because this is a journey. And so what I want to share with you is a piece that we have developed as not a mission statement, but really in the words of the feeling and sentiment that we want to hold for the people who are here. Out of respect for the time, I know we only have a few minutes left to do Q&A. And so what I'd like to do is just have you take this in, and we'll let you get ready to ask any questions you might have of either Glenn or of me.
Thank you both so much. So as a reminder to the audience, if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the question module. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen in the control panel. So while we wait, we do have one question that came in, and it's in regards to what types of positive changes have you noticed at Wieden+Kennedy since the training began? they can trace directly to the agency's participation in the Courageous Conversations About Race workshop.
Keesha, why don't you take that?
Sure. I think there are so many things to point to. The one is how, I would say, how moved people have been to, and I'm talking across races, how moved people have been to sit, to talk, to rethink. And so one of the changes is that when work has been reviewed, actual creative output, there are times where people are, and I'm talking creative directors, who will stop, want to get multiple perspectives on the work, and sometimes have even said, hey, can you look at this and tell me if this feels right? Am I missing anything? You know, and so the way that we are engaging and the way that people are actually taking stock as to what they're doing and making sure that their view and their life perspective isn't dominating the work in the wrong way, that's been healthy. The second is just open conversation and debates about cultural appropriation, which shows up a lot in advertising. And so being able to take a step back and also look and reflect on those things, I would say those are the things that have had the most direct impact on what we do every day. And there are many others that I can share as well, but I know we don't have time.
So we have time for one more question. And this one is, what can individuals do in an agency setting to start the conversation and encourage leadership to take an active part in the conversation and truly embracing diversity, going beyond the diversity handbook and actually take action?
I would say the first thing to the question, and Keesha, I'm going to hand it off to you again to specifically look at Wyden. But across my experience with large corporations as well as very small school districts and all in between, the key piece here is that everyone in the organization needs to see those with the highest level of authority and power engaging in the same clumsy work, not as experts, but as participants. And this enables the agency to actually be a learning organization again. The truth of the matter is, none of us here know the answer or have the solution to racial inequity and the lack of racial diversity and the challenge to achieve racial justice and to eliminate the disparities. And so we all have to be learners in this, and we have to create space for even those who are the bosses to be learners. Keesha?
Yeah, agree. I would say that if people are looking for a place to start, and I often come across people who are just like, how did you get buy-in? What was that conversation like? Well, you kind of have to understand a little bit about your culture to understand where to start. But I would also say that you have to look for partners on the inside. In terms of a very tactical approach, one is if you have a chief diversity officer and your head of HR and a small group of people who are willing to lock arms and come up with a plan, call a meeting with all of you. Get in a forum where you're looking at the data. Look at the industry data. Ask for and look at the data within your own office. Some of it you might see by walking your halls, but you may not know the actual percentages. And I do think it's important to have some sort of a reality check on where your company, your agency is from that perspective. The real work comes in, what are you going to do about it? And having a conversation with those groups of people I just mentioned is a critical one, because you need their help. If it's a chief diversity officer, your head of HR, you need their help to lead. You need their help to hold up the mantle. And you need people, a smaller group of people who are just regular employees that reflect the body of the people to share that voice and perspective of why it matters to you. And often I think those things get missed. I think either management takes it on and puts it on the mantle, or I think sometimes what happens, people take it on and don't know how to navigate it up. So I just think that if you created a forum with those people, you'll be able to have a good conversation. You'll be able to have hopefully a more actionable output as a result of that conversation. And we did put together an action guide that I think if you brought those questions to the table with that group of people, you'd be able to get somewhere. But there's a bit of discovery and understanding your culture and your environment that probably has to take place first.
Thank you so much, Keesha and Glenn, for this candid conversation, as well as for sharing your journey on this process with us. I know there's been a lot of takeaways that both I, as well as the audience, and we appreciate your honesty, as well as the guide for best practices. In terms of next steps, we'd just like to share with you that it's the third out of 4 webinars in our Talent Leadership Series. The next one is on Friday, and it's going to focus on unconscious bias beyond the training. We'd like to thank our Chief Talent Officer Council here at the 4As, who has helped to sponsor this series in particular and bring it to life for us. So again, thank you to all these agencies listed here, as well as Keesha and Glenn for taking the time out today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.